Reformers also sought to clean up, improve, and reform government. Political machines and corrupt mayors were thrown out of office. State and local governments were held responsible for the welfare of their citizens. And reforms were implemented to clean up elections, allowing citizens to have a greater say in who represents them in government. Election reforms of the Gilded Age ultimately made government more responsive to citizens. In order to be elected, you had to actually listen to your constituents and do what they wanted, as opposed to being in office purely for personal gain. First reform implemented was the secret ballot. It prevented voter fraud and took away powers from political machines by allowing voters to vote in private for their candidate.
Next is initiative. Voters can directly write a bill and put it on the ballot for passage.
Another election reform is referendum. Referendum is when voters vote on a ballot initiative. In California, we have a referendum every election when we vote on propositions placed on the ballot.
And finally, recall. A recall is when voters can remove officials from office early or call an election.
In October of 2003, Californians went to the ballot and recalled Governor Gray Davis, kicking him out of office. In his place, they elected Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Run! Go! Get to the chopper!
And then there's the 17th Amendment. In 1912, the Constitution was changed to allow the direct election of U.S. senators by the citizens themselves. Originally, the Founding Fathers had state governments select U.S. senators to send to Washington. Instead, now citizens themselves could directly elect their senators, making the Senate more responsive to the people. If you want to get re-elected to the Senate, you better do what the people want you to do.
All of this led to the election of 1912, one of the greatest elections in history, which consisted of 3 presidents running against each other: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. The Republican vote was split between the conservative Taft and the progressive Roosevelt, allowing the progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson to take the election. This election showed that Americans had a mandate for progressivism. By giving 75% of the total votes to progressive candidates, Wilson, a progressive, won overwhelmingly. The first thing Wilson focused on was tariffs and tax reform. Wilson lobbied Congress hard to lower tariffs that Taft had raised. Wilson won the fight, and Congress passed the Underwood Act in 1913. To make up for lost revenue, Wilson proposed a graduated income tax. This progressive tax system would tax higher incomes more and lower incomes less. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified and added to the Constitution, creating an income tax system.
Make sure to pay your taxes.
Some reformers thought morality, not wealth, would improve lives. Living morally would uplift the poor and give them a purpose and a drive. Many reformers called for temperance. Temperance is the prohibition of alcohol. One organization created on this reform movement was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Based on Christianity, they sang and prayed in saloons, they opened schools, and went to prisons, talking about sobriety and giving credibility to the women's suffrage movement. The temperance movement scored a huge success in the 1920s with prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment is enacted and alcohol is illegal. The law banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol, but did not ban the consumption of alcohol.
The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the one that guaranteed women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. In most cases, women were denied the right to vote in the 19th century. They started agitating for the right to vote openly and in public in the late 1840s and early 1850s after meetings in places like Seneca Falls in New York. After the Civil War, leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony thought that their fight to end slavery would get them included in the amendments like the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the rights to former slaves, and they lost. It was a devastating blow to their cause, and so they reorganized themselves in a long campaign for suffrage. Sometimes they did this on a state-by-state or territory-by-territory basis, especially effective out west. Then there were women led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who organized the National Women's Suffrage Association. They were fighting to change the Constitution. Sometimes they fought in the courts. They actually tried to vote. Susan B. Anthony got herself arrested at one point doing that. It was a stark moment in the history of women's rights, women being imprisoned and in some cases force-fed. Finally, by 1919, the Congress had endorsed, after much struggle, this proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and women began voting wholesale across the country in the presidential election of 1920.